Okay, I'm back. Ben is back. I was gone for 3 months, and as soon as the police were hot on my trail, I came back. And I'll be here for another 3 months, and then they'll probably figure it out. You know how they are. It takes about 3 months. So this is mastering the middle game. So I have to dumb the lecture down a little bit, because normally I teach about grandmastering the middle game. And in fact, speaking of grandmasters, we are going to discuss positions from the US Championship, which is ongoing as far as I'm concerned. As far as you're concerned, Fabiano's already won the tournament. So you're very confused over there. And Wesley So came in second. Yeah, disappointing finish for Hikaru, that's too bad. Okay, so let's talk about, we're actually after round 5 now. So we actually don't know what's gonna happen in the next 6 rounds, but you at home do. All right, cool. So the first game we're gonna look at was from round 1. Round 1 was actually the best round for the big 3. Chrysler, Caruana, and GM, no wait a minute, I'm sorry. GM, Nakamura, Toyota. Wait, I'm getting confused. Oh yeah, it's Wesley So, Fabiano, Caruana, and Hikaru Nakamura. They all won very nicely in round 1. And there was very good middle games in a lot of games of the US Championship. First one we're gonna look at is Caruana versus Akobian. Var not having his best tournament ever. Or is he? Oh, snap. Okay, so in this position, Var obviously fingered his bishop. And this is a very strange looking position because Black's not castled yet. It's not clear where he's going to castle. And White's castled queenside. However, White's made a lot of pawn moves on the king side. And that's actually where White can get more space. And so Fabiano played f4. And problem with Black's position is White's going to have basically a better position all 3 parts of the board, the center, queen side, and king side. And the reason Var played this variation and got to this position was he thought he could play queen h4 here, attacking the knight on h3, and it doesn't look good for the knight, but actually there's some tactics here. So he played bishop to d6, and after f5, White had an obvious advantage. But let's have a look at queen h4, which is what Var was intending to play when this happened. The idea is the knight on h3 is attacked. If the knight moves away, knight takes f4, attacking the queen, and attacking the rook on h1. Excuse me. So problem is, White can get very aggressive with the move knight g5. And now, to refute knight g5, since the queen is virtually trapped, we play the obvious move knight takes f4. Can anyone in the audience see what White does here? And this was the part that Var missed. He thought, I've won a pawn, I'm attacking the queen, I'm attacking the rook, I'm attacking the knight. It all sounds good until you see White's next move. Anyone? You at home? Nah, you're wrong at home too. No, nothing? You got nothing? All talking a badge? Okay, so we can throw in this check with bishop to b5. And this is a problem because Black can't do any of the stuff that I said because he's in check. And the problem with c6 is it blocks the bishop, so we've got rid of one of our threats. And now White can play queen e5, defending his knight, attacking this knight, and threatening to come into c7. And I'll give you a sample variation because you deserve it. You're paying customers. Let's trade some pieces. Let's take a free rook. Taking free rooks is good, right? And then let's get checkmated. Okay, Black's king, not so good. Okay, sort of exposed. So if we go back, it turns out after knight g5, and Var analyzed this for a long time in his head, he concluded White was winning, which was what Fabiano concluded. And unfortunately for Var, that's correct. Queen h4, knight g5 gives White close to winning advantage. Well, if he can't play queen h4, White's going to advance on the king's side, attack e6, and Black's king is misplaced. So sometimes strategically things are working out, but they don't work tactically. So bishop to d6, f5, attacking the e6 pawn. Var played queen e7. Bishop takes g7, winning a pawn, and bishop goes back to b2. And, well, at my level and lower, being a pawn up is good, but it's not really a guarantee of a victory. But at the top level, you know, the top 10, top 20 players in the world, it's rare to be a pawn ahead for nothing. And so when you get the chance their technique is impeccable. They almost always win. And here finally, very late in the game, Var castled. But I wouldn't say Var has any compensation for the pawn. He's just down a pawn. And unfortunately, that's the side of the board he lost on, the side of the board where he had a pawn less. Okay, rook f1, getting the rook off of the diagonal of the bishop. And obviously it's a good square for the rook. Rook e8, defending e6. f6, the pawn is defended by the bishop and the rook, so he can't capture it. And white just has a big space advantage on the king's side, plus white has an extra pawn. And, well, it wasn't really great middle game planning. It was very good planning, followed by good analysis. He knew that queen h4 didn't work for black. That's what black was counting on. And as a result, black's game went downhill very quickly. And we won't look too long into the end of the game, where basically white was a pawn up and eventually just crashed through. Could have crashed through earlier, but he was playing it safe because black doesn't really have any counterplay here. And that pawn on f6 is really annoying. Black really is passive in this position. And, well, basically you have to avoid time trouble. Knight takes f7. But white could have actually sacrificed on f7 or e6 several times, but now it was really obvious because after queen takes f7, white plays rook up to g7, getting his piece back. When it was an actual piece sack and white could play f7 and rook g8, it was also winning, but, well, it's not a piece sack now. Now we're just cleaning up. And black's king is very exposed, and white is still up 2 pawns. And the game ended, well, Var would normally resign. It's hard to resign when you have no time on your clock. You don't have time to resign, okay? And when they got to a position where there was nothing else to do, because b7 is attacked too many times, finally black gave up. So that was a great middle game from Fabiano, who won a pawn on the king's side, advanced his king's side pawns, and eventually crashed through on the king's side with the move knight takes f7. His pawn on f6 was a really nice pawn that anchored his rook on g7. Okay, now I've been away for months. I don't know how to get to the next game, so I guess the lecture's over. Now I'll figure out something. Okay, we'll get rid of this. We'll go here. We'll go to this other game. All right, there we go. Now this was also from round 1, and I was going to say this is probably the biggest crush Kamsky's ever had in the US Championship, except later in the tournament, in a position that was, well, equal or slightly worse maybe, he made a terrible blunder and lost to Jeffrey Zhang. This game wasn't a one-move blunder. This was a real crush of one of Kamsky's favorite openings, the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez. Okay, now this position looks somewhat equal. Probably most of us would prefer to have white, because white has these nice 2 center pawns here, and black's pawn is a little back. And the bishop on b7 is somewhat blockaded as well. On the other hand, what does white do about it? It's not easy to break through. Well, in a lot of Ruy Lopez's, white breaks through on a flank, either on the king's side or the queen's side. Since they've traded pawns and rooks on the queen's side, and black's queen is off sides, it's time to attack the king, and he played knight h4. And, well, white's going to try to put a knight on f5, put a queen on f3, and start attacking the black king. Queen d8 was played, a move that I agree with, getting the queen back into defense. And Kamsky's been known throughout his career of having worse positions, defending, and then when his opponent goes a little too far, Kamsky counterattacks and wins. Wesley played queen c1, attacking the pawn on h6, and now Gata made the losing move. He made sort of the obvious move of defending the pawn, but that allows white a piece sacrifice that crashes through. Instead, he should be very concerned about these knights and play knight to h7, which gives a discovered attack on the knight on h4. And after the game, Wesley said, yeah, knight h7, I sort of expected that. I was going to move my knight back to f3, and probably black has to play h5 to save his pawn. And I thought white was a little better, maybe some move like rook to d1, and try to open the d file. And, you know, play against black making a lot of weakening kingside pawn moves, and the bishop on b7 sort of blocked. And again, white has more center pawns on the 4th rank. So white's a little bit better. And that's what black should have done. And probably if Kamsky was in good form, he would have played knight h7. Instead, his sense of danger eluded him today, and for another round, and he played the move king h7, which defends the pawn on h6. And unfortunately, the computers were screaming, we had to turn the volume down, that white has a winning sacrifice and a winning attack. And those aren't the kinds of moves that Wesley so misses. Wesley's very accurate and plays very aggressively. He played one of his knights to f5, sacrificing a piece. And the problem is, we have what's called long-term compensation. We don't have to win right away. We can say, well, I'm going to build up my attack, and my knight's on f5 the whole game. Your pieces are all terrible, and I have many threats. I'm threatening to take on h6. I'm threatening to take on d6, which, by the way, forks everything. And I'm also threatening to move my rook up to the 3rd rank. And later in the game, he could play queen d1 and get his queen over to the king side. It's not really clear what black does. Black can say, yeah, I'm up a piece. Okay, and after the game, I think Wesley was talking about the move rook e6, which said it surprised him, although I think the engines like that move. He was expecting something like knight g8, defending his pawn on h6, and then knight takes d6. And obviously, white has tremendous compensation for a piece. Probably he's going to win an exchange back and simply be equal or up material with black having a terrible king. White's king, on the other hand, is very safe. Okay, so Gata played rook e6. Bishop takes h6. Obviously, we can't trade. That's a very simple checkmate. Queen takes h6, and checkmate. Okay, so black followed my rule of never trading and played knight to e8, defending his bishop. And again, white doesn't have an immediate win. White just builds the pressure, has 2 pawns for a piece, makes a lot of threats. And the 2 reasons white's winning, white has this beautiful knight on f5, and white also has the bishop opposite the king on this diagonal, which allows him often to play the move d5. And if we trade on d5, it opens up this diagonal for the white bishop. So white has a lot of possible threats. Again, white doesn't want to trade pieces. White wants to keep the attack going. So he plays bishop to g5. And here, Gata made his position even worse, which is actually very hard to see beforehand. He played sort of the obvious move, bishop f6. We want to trade pieces. Unfortunately, after takes, it's very hard to take back. There's 4 ways to do it, and they're all bad. Okay, normally, with black's moving pieces towards his own king, that would be awesome. But he has some issues. One issue is he doesn't want to allow queen h6 or queen g5. So, for example, if you take with either knight, then you just get checkmated. Okay, as we saw before. Okay, so obviously we have to take with the rook or the queen. Gata ended up taking with the queen, which, well, they're both really bad. I'm not sure which is worse. I think taking with the queen is a little worse than with the rook, but in the end they're both losing. After rook takes, white has 2 good plans, and actually he can play both of them. He's going to play queen d1 and queen h5 check. He's going to play rook e3 and rook g3. And with the queen, rook, and knight attacking the black king, and the fact that this bishop on b7 is out of play, it's a pretty safe attack for white. The extra piece is meaningless for black because his pieces don't do anything. Okay, Gata played queen takes f6, and that was based on a miscalculation. He saw that his rook would be trapped after the move d5. The rook has nowhere to go. And he played rook e7, thinking he was going to give back an exchange since he's already up a piece. Of course, if we trade on d5 and just try to win a pawn, now every legal knight move is a discovered check. And many of them are good. Probably the best is knight e3 check or knight e7, taking the bishop on d5. And then white's just winning. Okay, so Gata played rook e7, obviously expecting knight takes rook, queen takes knight. And he would have 2 knights for a rook. White would have an extra pawn or 2, but it would be hard to checkmate black because the pieces are gone. And well, if my student Matt Larson or my good friend Patrick Wolf, former US champion, are watching this game, well, here white played the favorite move of either player. They both like this move, and I'm sure they would have found it. And it was funny, when this move was played, Gata was shaking his head, and Hikaru was standing behind Gata shaking his head. So it was a repetition of head shaking. And the move that was played has the idea of forcing the queen off of the rook so we can take the rook for free. That's better than taking the rook and losing your knight. So what move did white play which attempted to force the black queen away from the rook? Does anybody remember, or can they figure it out?
G4.
G4, very good. And if you know Patrick Wolf or Matt Larson, that's their favorite move, G4. And white's going to play G5 next move. And I don't legally see how these four pieces can defend the black rook, and the black rook can't move. So I'm going to play G5, and you're going to move your queen, and I'm going to take your rook for free. And then not only is white trying to checkmate black, white is ahead material. And obviously when Gata took with the queen, he didn't see the move G4, otherwise he would have taken with the rook. Although, well, usually when your game is really bad, you need to be a supercomputer to defend perfectly every move and just have a worse loss position as opposed to losing right away. Now Gata, of course, over the last 20 years has been that kind of player where when he is worse, he defends perfectly and eventually hopes his opponent falters. This game, neither one happened. He made a couple of defensive mistakes, and Wesley did not falter. A really brutal win in round one. And in fact, for those of you who remember last year when Wesley was forfeited on move 6 against Akobian, he actually won every game afterwards. He won the last 2 rounds of the US Championship, and he won the first 2 rounds of this US Championship, and beating Gata twice. He beat Gata with the black pieces last year after the forfeit, and he beat Gata with the white pieces this year. So Wesley he's not number 10 for no reason. And as of today for me, not for you, Wesley's only 3 points lower rated than Nakamura. So maybe by the time you watch this, I don't know who will be higher rated. Probably not the same rating. Okay, we'll get rid of this for confusion. Okay, now we'll look at another one of the very interesting middle games. This was actually too complicated for me. I had my engines running, I had grandmasters helping me, but I just decided to sit in the corner and ball myself up in a fetal position because I couldn't understand this game. So this was a French defense. It's a favorite variation of Conrad Holt, who has black in these positions all the time. It looks like white's advancing on the king's side and black's advancing on the queen's side. It looks like that because that's what's happening. Okay? Unfortunately for black, white has more space. White can just chill out and eventually advance, or he can wait for black to advance to his detriment. Okay? And white has a very long, complicated sequence of moves which will eventually break through on the king's side. And that is to play h5. And in fact, white played bishop d2. But let me show you what white's plan is, and we won't make any moves for black because that wouldn't be fair. White wants to play h5 at some point, then retreat his knight, and black moves back and forth. I'm just showing white's plan. White eventually plays f4, takes with a knight, and black moves back and forth. Now, white can put his rooks on the f-file, and this queen's not very happy. There's going to be a discovered attack against that queen. And another plan for white is simply to break through on the king's side by pushing the pawns. Now, Shankland realized in the long run that would be a very good plan for white. Okay, so let's go back to the real position. Okay, and Fabiano played a move here he actually wasn't happy with later. He played the move bishop d2. Okay, and b4 was played, which was somewhat surprising because you would think the point of bishop d2 was to stop that. But actually, the bishop can't dance at 2 weddings. It's not going over here and defending the knight on f4. If the bishop ever goes to a5 or b4 or c3, black's going to play queen takes knight check. Okay, now what's funny is Shankland broke through on the queen's side, the normal plan, and because of that, Fabiano switched his pieces over to the queen's side and took over. That's the problem with playing the number 2 player in the world. Sometimes when they're winning on one side, they decide I'm going to win on the other side too. That was a Karpov trademark. Now here, white has more space on the king's side, white has more space in the center, black's winning on the queen's side, so Fabiano just shifts over there. Problem is, even though black has a lot of pawns here on the queen's side, it seems like his pieces are on the king's side. So he's not really helping his pawns along. Okay, so Fabiano traded the pawns, getting rid of his weak a pawn, opening up his rook, and then played rook to b1. He's sort of abandoning his kingside attack because he wants to win on all 3 parts of the board. And knight c6, defending the pawn, queen e3. The queen defends the c pawn, the d pawn, and the knight. The queen's much better on e3. b3 getting a passed pawn. And now, as we've seen a lot of French defenses, the bishop on the dark squares likes to go to a3 and go on this nice long diagonal. Well, that wasn't happening for a long time because white had a pawn on a3 and white's bishop was on e3, but that's all changed. And so Fabiano found the very nice maneuver, bishop c1. He's going to play bishop a3 and the rook on f8 is trapped. Well, we might not even want the rook on f8. We want to play bishop to d6 and our bishop is fantastic. Okay, so this is a really nice maneuver by Fabiano. Bishop to d7, defending the rook. We could take the pawn on c2, but we're going to lose that pawn. That's not going to be defended. And white can trade rooks on b8, for example, and then play the move bishop a3. And I don't know what you're going to do about this. So this is going to be a winning position for white. And if black gets any ideas of defending his c pawn, unfortunately his bishop's hanging. So the truth hurts. Okay, and that bishop is going to get to a really good square. Okay, so bishop d7 connecting the rooks, bishop a3, he takes the pawn on c2, and Fabiano plays rook c1. So Fabiano is going to get his bishop to a really nice square. He's going to infiltrate with his rook. This pawn's going to fall, and white's going to be winning on all three sides of the board. But white hasn't won the game yet. Now Sam can hunker down and defend and say there's nothing for you to do. You can't win. And that's exactly what he did. He tried to just defend and say, well, what are you going to take? How are you going to mate me? What are you going to do? Even though white has an advantage on all three sides of the board, what exactly does he do? Okay, and that's why we have world-class technique here. And it was a very nice maneuver. When he infiltrated with his pieces on the queen side, there was still no easy way to win for white. Just repeating moves and trying to put black in zugzwang, but not easy. Okay, knight h3 is a good move, and g5. Just getting more of the position. Sam blocks it up. Now white has even more space. Black really has nothing to do. And eventually, there's a lot of good squares here on the queen side for the white knight. The knight's not needed on f4 anymore. And by playing the move g5, black can't push his pawns on the king side, so white's king is perfectly safe. So white adds another piece into the attack and gets his king safe to the queen side before doing anything. Knight b5, knight a7, and finally he's in trouble. In this position, if he plays the move bishop takes knight, which looks like it wins a piece, black plays rook b8 and gets his piece back. All of white's pieces are hanging. And if he plays the move queen takes knight instead of knight a7, then the knight on b5 is hanging. So very good defense by Sam, but Fabiano didn't fall for any of that. Fabiano just played knight a7 and said, okay, your rook's attacked, your knight's attacked, I finally crashed through. And it took a long time, but black didn't have any counterplay. And after knight a7, Sam resigned because he's going to lose, well, at least a piece, if not more, and white crashed through. Now, earlier in the game, there was a very funny point where black had counterplay with a very unusual move. In this position, when he played king e3, there was the crazy move, queen f7, sacrificing the rook. And in fact, Fabiano said he saw this move right after he played king e3, and he was just going to trade queens and try to crash through later. The idea is after queen takes rook, black plays queen f5, threatening queen d3 check with a perpetual check. And these white pieces are not very well placed to stop queen d3 and the queen infiltration. So that was Sam's last chance to defend, although it's very hard to see a move which intentionally gives away a rook when you're hoping for perpetual check, which it turns out would have been the case if he had taken the rook. Very similar, we were doing live commentary, Alejandro and I, reminded me of the Kasparov Deep Blue match where Kasparov resigned in a drawn position. He could have sacrificed a piece and tried for perpetual, thinking, well, the computer wouldn't let me do that. The computer's winning, it wouldn't be perpetual, but in fact it had. And this was a conundrum his seconds were in. Should they tell him about it? and he would be furious that he resigned in a drawn position? Or should they not tell him about it until after the match? But what if he reads about it on the internet? What if somebody on the street tells him? Like, then he's like, what do you mean? Why did you guys tell me I was drawing? So yeah, here, queen f7 gave some chances. Probably black would lose in the long run with a queen trade since he really can't move anything. So it's a very difficult defensive task when your opponent's putting pressure on you. There's no direct threat, but you're very passive. And that's the trademark of Fabiano, and other strong players who like to play that way are Karpov and Kamsky, Onischuk. A lot of top players like to squeeze their opponents. Okay, now this was a really interesting middle game, because the players tried to make it interesting. White sacrificed a pawn. White has tons of compensation. First of all, he's putting tremendous pressure on the pin here with the king and queen. He has the 2 bishops. Black's extra pawn is pretty weak. I mean, you could argue it's good white doesn't have a d pawn because his bishop is strong, his rook can go on the half-open file, and black has trouble getting his king safe. So white has great compensation for a pawn, and that's because the players chose to play that way. Lenderman decided, I'm going to win a pawn, I'm going to defend, and hopefully my extra pawn will tell in the end. And Onischuk thought, with my 2 bishops and attack, I can crash through. Okay, he played bishop c3. And now, sort of surprising move. I mean, you'd think black wants to play knight ge7. That's why he played his bishop to f6. But instead he ran to safety with king f8. He's going to put his king on g7 and say, look, I'm a pawn up, so I'm going to win eventually. You don't have any attack. Castles, king g7. And now, very strong move, one I always advise against. That's why I'm not allowed to play in the championship anymore. f3. And the idea behind f3 is it's going to open white's rook up and put tremendous pressure on black's position. And often, when your opponent has a pawn on e4 and you play f3 getting rid of it, you get rid of a lot of black's advantages. Well, now black's in a lot of trouble, and the computer says black is fine, basically because the computer's crazy. It plays perfect for both sides and eventually says black is okay. If you're a human here, you really want to have white. The extra pawn doesn't matter right now. Your king is safer, you have 2 bishops, you have an initiative, and the rook on h8 is trapped. The other rook is in the corner. The knight hasn't been developed yet. You're really happy if you're white here. The extra pawn doesn't bother you. Okay, knight takes d4, which gives away the queen but threatens this queen. White doesn't want to trade all the pieces. He takes with the pawn, and now he's threatening the queen. The queen moves away. We open up the f file, obviously. And now the move rook e1. Morphy will be proud of this move. I don't think it's the computer's first choice, but I like it because it takes white's only inactive piece and gives him a threat. And in this position, Aleksandr and I were like, wow, this game's going to end pretty soon. And white's really crashing through and crushing black. And the engine's like, oh, equal. And we're like, equal. And the engine wants to play the move a6 here, which is a very strange move for a human, forcing white to make more threats. Okay? So if I was black, I would never consider the move a6 because it forces my opponent's bishop to a better square. And somehow the computer defends everything and says black is okay. Again, there's a big difference between computer and human chess. When a computer can play perfectly for one side and find moves that aren't obvious and say that it's equal, and a human can't do that, like we know that white's going to win here because even if white plays substandard moves, he's still going to have a great attack. And black has to defend perfectly. Okay, he played rook c8, getting the rook to an open file, sort of like what Onischuk just did, but now Onischuk gets his pawn back. And not only is the material equalized now he's ready to continue attacking on the f file. And now black has just lost. Rook c7, defending the f7 pawn. Bishop to b4. Bishop takes d4 check is a terrible move, which ends the game quickly. Black wants to get some material for his suffering, but he's opening up the f file for white's rook. The king moves to safety. And now, we were doing some analysis of the game, wondering how white can win. We agreed that white would play exactly what he did, but the computer found an incredibly beautiful win here, which none of us would have thought of. Does anybody remember? You guys remember every game of the tournament? You at home? No?
Rook up to...
There we go. There's somebody who's following the tournament. Rook to e6, and I was like, wait, rook to e6, what's going on? Well, the obvious idea is if you take the bishop, bishop f8 check wins the queen. So that's good for white. And the less obvious idea is if you take the rook, then bishop f8, always play bishop f8, checkmate. Checkmate's good because you win. And obviously, you could take with the queen and lead to the same checkmate. And Onischuk said he looked at rook e6, but not in this position. He saw these ideas with bishop f8, but it didn't occur to him here. Well, the problem is, if you can't take the rook and you can't take the bishop, where does your queen go? Yeah, good answer. So rook e6 was the computer move. I didn't think he was going to play that. I thought he would play exactly what he played. Rook takes d4 and bishop c3. And there's a funny variation here. He did take back immediately. He could take on f7 either way. But after taking back, black can't defend f7. The queen is attacked, and no queen move can safely defend f7. So obviously, white is just winning. And now, white's technique was, how we should say, a little unusual. He decided to win an easily winning endgame. Most of us would try to punish that king on h6. But Onischuk likes the endgame. So queen f8 check, not something I would have done. And he's like, I have a winning endgame. Your rook and knight can't move. No good. And he played king g7. And he's like, well, you can move your knight, but I'll be 2 pass pawns up. So that's fine. And eventually played rook f7 instead of taking the pawn, again stopping black from moving his pieces. And it was an easily winning endgame. White didn't really have any problems since black can't move anything. Nice repetition. And okay, hopeless endgame for black. White has an extra pawn. Now white has 2 extra pawns. If black had done something about his pawn on h7, white would have played king d4, and black can't do anything. So he stopped king d4, but he gave another pawn to do it. And this is absolutely no problem for white. 2 extra pawns, and eventually Lenderman resigned. We were sort of half joking during the game, you know, would Onischuk try to trade queens going to an endgame? Then he did. So he likes endgames. What are you going to do? Okay, and last but not least, the game of the tournament thus far, maybe there'll be better games after this video is made, between Caruana and Nakamura. In fact, it was the only decisive game of the round for the championship. The other games were drawn so they could watch this game. Now, of course, many of us were expecting a Berlin or a Petrov or something where black's trying to equalize. But Nakamura had less points than Caruana and thought it was time to win. He had drawn Kamsky with the black pieces, and with white, he got nothing against Aleksandr. Very surprising result. So Nakamura, having half a point less than Fabiano, decided to play for a win with black. Very dangerous idea. And he played the Najdorf Sicilian with an early h5. To paraphrase Sam Shankland, I'm not paraphrasing, he said that's garbage. Okay, h5. Sam Shankland never won to mince words. Okay, and well, Hikaru decided his position might be okay, but castling kingside with the pawn on h5 is a little dicey. So he decided to castle queenside, also dicey. And he played the move g6, making his kingside solid, and then castled queenside, surprising many of us. Now, black has a couple of good continuations, e5 or f5, and the engine actually prefers e5. Actually, it's pretty funny. In chess, sometimes it's not what you do, it's what you don't do. And here, you might think, black castled queenside, that's terrible, he'll get checkmated. Well, maybe. The other problem with castling queenside in any opening is you're weakening your f7 pawn. And when you castle kingside, you're not weakening anything. When you castle queenside, f7 is never protected, unless you do it artificially. Rook f8, rook h7, bishop e8, those are strange moves. Okay, and so both moves that white made have the intention of attacking f7. Fabiano played f5, which is sort of a normal kind of move with the bishop on b3. Computer even prefers e5, and the main idea is, if your knight moves away, I'm going to play knight e4 with tempo, and if you trade pawns first, I'm going to get an active rook on the 7th rank and win a pawn. So that's also quite good for white. Fabiano chose f5, and after e5 attacking the knight, retreated his knight, and now f7 is attacked, and I'm going to attack it again. And also of great importance is now that black has played e5, his pawn's no longer on e6, the d5 square is very weak. White has access to the d5 square that he didn't have before, and that's actually going to be key later. Okay, so Nakamura took a pawn, and white has many good continuations. There's a couple of pawns to take, but instead Fabi played knight to g5. He wants to take a pawn, followed by taking a rook. And now he's unleashed another attack on the f5 pawn. So that's a lot of pawns getting attacked now. Nakamura correctly sacrificed the exchange with f4, giving himself a nice pawn chain. And also, maybe he'll play bishop g4 and skewer the queen and rook. And to me, this was the nicest move of the game, and I'm sure Jennifer Shahadi liked it. It was a rover, or a rook lift. He played rook to d3. This avoids the bishop g4 skewer, and when this knight moves, probably to d5, rook c3 is going to be a very serious threat. So I like the move rook d3 a lot. It gets the rook out of the way of this bishop, and it starts attacking. King b8, getting off of this file. Knight f7. Hikaru played for the attack, h4. And after queen f2, computer says black is still maybe okay. And very interesting move that wasn't played that Fabiano showed us here in the analysis room was the move d5. Okay, the top players are always looking for counterplay for their opponents. The idea is we want to take with the bishop and play the moves knight h5 to g3 and start a mating attack. For example, let's trade queens, play knight takes d5, looks good for white, and now the move knight h5, suddenly knight g3 is a very serious threat. Very serious. Okay, and then if you take with the pawn, you actually get checkmated. So we can play a stupid move, I'm good at that. Knight g3 check, checkmate. Okay, and Fabiano saw that kind of counterplay and was a bit worried about it. And he said, after d5, I was going to do this, and it's complicated. But instead, Hikaru made quite a bad move, queen b4, and this was based on a miscalculation. And he just said he wasn't calculating well that day. So, play the number 2 player in the world, you have the black pieces, you're not playing well, easy to lose. And the computer was explaining this really strong move that we didn't get right away, and Fabi said this is where he saw it. He played knight to d5, sort of the obvious move, because it threatens everything. Black is forced to trade. Now, white's going to play rook b3, winning immediately. The only obvious reason to play queen b4 is now you can play bishop a4, stopping rook b3 and winning a pawn. And while this looks like black has a pawn for the exchange, the b2 pawn is hanging, black has more space on the king side. Unfortunately, the move rook a3 is incredibly crushing. This is actually better than rook a1 because of the threat of c3. And while the bishop on a4 is actually going to be trapped, and you can't move the bishop because rook b3 is going to be crushing. For example, if I go here, we just trade bishops and rook b3 wins your queen. It's funny the way Hikaru played king b8 to get off of this queen c5, and then he played queen b4 with his king on b8, and it's the same thing. And if the bishop goes all the way back, for example, rook b3 is again crushing. There's no defense to the attack on the b file. And in fact, in this position, the computer was saying bishop c8 was the best move. That wasn't the point of queen b4. But it sees that it's going to get checkmated, so it plays some move that's obviously losing. Okay, and now, well, now the engines were saying +3, +4, +5, which means it's all over. Hikaru tried for counterplay, h3, but while his bishop needs to be defended, and in fact, one of the main lines of the computer was bishop to d8, c3, queen b6, trading queens and losing the bishop, but you don't get checkmated. See, and those are variations humans just don't look at because we don't go into rook down endgames. We try to do something else. But when that's the best variation for black, that's when the analysts know that it's a losing position. Okay, so he played h3, getting counterplay, c3, queen b5, defending the bishop, b3, the bishop is trapped. And obviously, if white had played rook to a1 instead of rook to a3, his rook on d3 would be hanging now. it's very important to play rook a3 instead of rook a1, something that Fabiano noticed right after queen b4. And in fact, I said to Alejandro Ramirez, my co-commentator, do you think Fabi will find rook a3? And he said, he's 2,800, he has to. Okay, otherwise it'd take his rating away. It was funny, a few days ago, one of our local chess guys here, members, said, wow, these guys play really good. And I said, yeah, that's why we invite him here. Okay, you guys are playing great. I'm like, yeah, they play great. Okay, so bishop h4 getting some counterplay. Pawn takes the bishop on a4. Obviously, if you take the queen and I take your queen, you're down a rook in the endgame. So he keeps his queen. g3. And this basically kills the rook on h8. Nakamura resigned here. You could take the pawn and you could win the pawn, but this king is actually sheltered quite nicely by the h3 pawn. So there's just no play here for black. Black's down a rook, and there's no attack against white's king. Soon, there will be an attack against the black king when white plays rook b3 or rook b1 or queen f7. Yeah, that's going to be bad for black. So black's down a rook, and he's going to get checkmated soon. After g3, he resigned. A really nice win from Fabi. And, well, it gave him a 1.5 point lead over Nakamura. And, well, right now it's a two-person race. Caruana and So tied for first with 4 out of 5. There's 6 rounds left. You guys at home know what happened. You're smarter than I am. You knew that before the broadcast, but now you know even more. Well, I hope you enjoyed those games. I enjoyed most of them. The ones where I bet against the guy, I see here, hold on a second. I get paid next week. Okay, but maybe I can make some more bets before it's broadcast and I can break even. This is Grandmaster Ben Finegold back in St. Louis. I'll see you guys twice a week for more videos. Mamba out.